Abandon all hope, those who enter here, for I am the Dungeon Master! Just kidding. Welcome to the first episode of Behind the Screen. My name's DJ, and I'm going to help you learn how to GM or DM a role-playing game. Now, there are two games I want to talk to you about. These are the two that I hold dearest to me, and the two that I have the most experience with, so I figured I'd let you know about these two. First of all, we've got the newest edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, this is the classic role-playing game. When somebody talks about a pen and paper RPG, they're usually talking about Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I picked 4th edition because it's what most people are playing now. A lot of people stick with 2nd edition or 3rd edition, but with the newest 4th edition, they fixed a lot of things that were wrong with the game. Now, provided it's not perfect, but it's what we're playing now, and frankly, it's really fun. It's a good system, especially for new people to the role-playing scene. I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun with it. Second of all, we have White Wolf's World of Darkness system. Now, this is a more story-based system, less door crashing and running in and killing a lot of monsters, although that can be done. It's got a more story-based feel to it. You need to work a lot harder to run this, but I find that in the end, you'll come out on top. It's a lot more rewarding for the GM. So now that you've been introduced to our two main systems, the first thing I'm going to go over is materials. Now, this is the kind of stuff that every GM needs. First, we're going to go over D&D in this video, because D&D is more common, and I'm going to do that first. So, here we go. So in front of me here, I have the basic materials. First of all, you see this? This is a DM screen, or a GM screen, or a game screen, whatever you want to call it. It's a screen. Now, in role-playing games, I figure you'd know that when the GM rolls a dice, he doesn't want the players to see it, so that he can hide what happened to the players, or he can fudge rolls, or he can do any of that kind of stuff. You're going to need one of these. Now, you can go out and buy a White Wolf one like I have here. I have a Mage the Awakening screen here with a whole lot of handy information on the back. You can get ones for D&D as well. They're usually kind of on the expensive side for a piece of cardboard, so you're going to expect to pay around $10 for one of these, but they're an invaluable tool. Now, if you're really cheap like I am, and you don't feel like buying this kind of stuff, you can always say, take some of the cardstock. Like, I've got some cardstock here. Oh, this is Staples for $6. Really good stuff to print character sheets on. And you could just take a couple of these and tape them together if you wanted to, just to make a GM screen. But you need something. I can't stress the importance of a GM screen enough. The players need to not be able to see what you're doing. Second of all, we've got the obvious. Pencils. Keep them around, for the love of God. So many times have I been in games when the game is completely stopped in the middle of a very dramatic scene because somebody needed to go get a pencil to jot something down. Have them around. They're handy, I hear. Second of all is the other most important thing about role-playing games, dice. Everybody's got to have dice. Now, this all depends on what game you're playing, what dice you need. For D&D, we're going to be using the standard dice array, which is a D20, a D12, 2D10, one with singles and one marked with 10s, a D8, a D6, and a D4. I threw the D4. So, you're going to need all those dice. Well, not specifically, your character might not use, say, a D12, but you're going to need one around just in case. Go to a hobby store, pick up a pack of these dice. If you're going to be playing D&D, it'll be worth it. Alright, so next up on our list of materials is combat items. Now, in D&D, the combat is grid-based, so there's, 5-foot squares, and it's a lot of rules, and you're going to need to get used to them. But I find you can't really do great combat in Dungeons & Dragons unless you have these two things. First of all, miniatures. These are the new D&D miniatures. Well, they're not new, they've been around for a few years. They're basically little pieces of plastic you can buy for a few bucks at your hobby stores. And they illustrate your characters on the grid. Now, these are really, really, really helpful during combat. I find them almost invaluable now, so much so that before we went out and bought miniatures, we were using Kinder Surprise toys like you saw in my last video. Now, while Kinder Surprise toys are a very, very cheap way to illustrate yourselves on a grid, picking up some of these is a good idea. Even if you're just going to have some basic ones. Like for here, I've got a beholder. Like, you can't have D&D without beholders. And we've also got some character miniatures, like this is a Tiefling Warlock, you know. Basically stuff to represent yourself in a grid. And speaking of a grid, this is a grid. This is kind of interesting stuff. I love doing this kind of thing. Basically, I picked up a giant sheet of these, just giant grid sheets at Staples, and you should be able to pick them up too. For about $10, you can get a grid of about 60 pages, and they're awesome. You can draw on them, you can mark stuff on them, you can do whatever you want, and they're huge. I mean, you can make some really big stuff with this. Next up is something that a lot of the old school D&D players are going to not quite agree with, and that is something that I find invaluable behind the screen nowadays, a computer. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Bringing, you know, technology into role-playing. Now, I'm going to go over some programs and stuff in later videos that will aid you in your D&D process, but a computer, really, really helpful when you're playing D&D. Get the PDFs of the books if you have to. I mean, if you own the books already, then there's no reason for you to not have PDFs of them on your computer. Next up is something that most D&D sessions need to have to exist. Food. Now, I know it's a funny thing, but your characters are gonna your players are gonna get really, really alienated if you don't have something for them to snack on. Sitting around playing D&D for 5 hours is kind of a grueling process, and unless you have something to nibble on, it's gonna feel a lot longer than it is. I mean, you're having fun and all, but you want nibbles. You want some food. Next up, I'm going to talk to you about something that's very, very important for any D&D game. It's the setting. Now, most people just play in a random room, most likely in a basement or in somebody's, living room. And that's all cool. First of all, the first main problem with this is distraction. Distraction is a huge problem if you're trying to run a decent game like this. If you're in the middle of combat, and, people are starting to get tired of it, and you're trying to wrap up the combat, if there's anything around, they'll start playing with it. Another thing that's very important is music. Now, a lot of people don't take this into consideration. A lot of people sit there in their silence and play the role-playing games. They think it enhances their mood, but it doesn't. Now, music is a really important thing when you're trying to get an atmosphere going. Whether it be something like a normal, regular D&D fantasy thing where you can use just kind of background rock music, or if you want to go full-on Lord of the Rings, orchestral Peter Jackson stuff, you can do that. Now, one thing about the music, though, if you're going to play D&D and you're going to use these sweeping orchestral scores, you better be a pretty good DM, because that stuff gets cheesy really, really fast, and people get tired of it really fast. I know I do. I can't stand using this stuff. It drives me crazy. And a lot of players are the same way. The last thing about setting is the lighting. Now, this is another thing a lot of people don't think about. And normally it doesn't really have to matter. The main thing lighting is important for if you're trying to do a horror-based or thriller campaign. Say if you're playing Ravenloft. I played in a Ravenloft game once where the entirety of the table was only candlelit, and it was awesome. Set up a really creepy atmosphere. We were in some Dracula's castle or something like that, some vampire stuff. Really, really cool. Screw around with the lighting if you can. If you're playing a regular D&D game, it shouldn't matter that much. You should just have normal lighting, like enough so the players can see their sheets and see each other and see you, and that's fine. But if you're doing like a World of Darkness thing or a Ravenloft, or if you're going for some sort of dark fantasy, you might want to try out a bit of a dimmer lighting. It can always it can add something to your game you wouldn't think it happened. That's all for the first edition of Behind the Screen. My name is DJ, and I hope you've learned something from this. I'll be back next time. It shouldn't be too long, with a introduction to making characters for Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. And I'll see you then. Happy role-playing.